The war was ending, but for many German women, it did not feel like peace. In the spring of 1945, Allied columns rolled deep into a collapsing Reich. Cities lay in rubble. Bridges sagged across rivers. Columns of refugees shuffled down roads, clutching children and bundles of cloth, eyes hollow. Among them were women who would soon be taken prisoner, not as combatants, but as suspected auxiliaries, camp workers, or simply as those swept up in the chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire. The Americans would chain them, starve them, humiliate them. Nazi propaganda had hammered the warnings for years. The enemy will strip you of honor. Better to die than to fall into their hands. Mothers whispered these lines to daughters at night, tucking knives beneath pillows. Women rehearsed stories they might tell under interrogation, anything to keep dignity intact. So when US troops finally arrived at one small collection of prisoners, a mix of former factory workers, widows, and a few young auxiliaries, terror swept through the camp like smoke. The women huddled together, clutching torn coats around thin shoulders, bracing for the chains. First encounters, boots crunched on gravel as American guards entered. Helmets low, rifles slung, their shadows stretched across the ground. The women stared, wide-eyed, every muscle tense. An order was barked in English, sharp and alien. An interpreter stepped forward, speaking in halting German. "You will remain calm. You are prisoners now. You will be treated according to law." The words meant little. Law was not safety. Law was whatever the conqueror decided. One young woman, Greta, gripped her sister's hand. "Now they will bind us," she whispered. "Now comes the shame." But no chains appeared. Instead, the Americans organized them into groups, counting, registering names. A guard handed each a piece of bread. The women accepted cautiously, nibbling in silence, waiting for the moment when generosity would flip into cruelty. That night, they were led into a makeshift enclosure, a barn hastily converted into barracks. Straw lined the floor, blankets were passed out. The women lay awake in the dark, listening to the footsteps of guards outside. Each creak of boots made them flinch. "Tomorrow," an older woman muttered, "tomorrow they will show their true face." The shock, morning came. The women braced themselves. Chains, perhaps. Orders to march, perhaps. Humiliation, certainly. Instead, the guards carried in crates. The women shrank back, certain the boxes contained restraints, but when the lids were pried open, the contents left them speechless. Needles, thread, cloth scraps, small scissors, sewing kits. The interpreter gestured awkwardly, searching for words. "For you. To fix clothes. To sew." The silence in the barn deepened. The women stared, uncomprehending. One young mother whispered, "Is this a test? They want to see who will beg?" But the soldiers simply set the kits down and stepped back. Finally, one woman, Anna, a seamstress before the war, reached forward with trembling hands. She picked up a spool of thread, holding it like a relic. Her fingers itched with muscle memory long dormant. She threaded a needle, lifted her daughter's torn sleeve, and stitched. The room watched as she mended cloth instead of breaking under chains. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "They gave us this?" she whispered. "Not shackles, but this?" Others followed hesitantly. Dresses were patched, blankets reinforced, children's sleeves repaired. The barn filled with the quiet rhythm of needles, the sound so ordinary it became extraordinary in the shadow of war. For women who had expected humiliation, the sewing kits struck harder than any weapon. Each stitch contradicted years of fear. Each repaired hem suggested dignity might still exist, even in captivity. Greta looked at her sister that night, both wrapped in a blanket newly patched with American thread. "They could have given us chains," she said. "Instead, they gave us tools." Her sister whispered back, "Maybe that is worse." because now I do not know what to believe." The shock was not cruelty, but the absence of it. And in that absence, confusion took root, the kind of confusion that lingers long after wounds fade. The barn that had once echoed with sobs and whispers of doom now carried a new sound, the quiet, steady rhythm of sowing. At first it had been hesitant, like the fluttering of frightened birds. But within a week the women of the camp had found their rhythm. Needles pierced cloth, thread pulled tight, hems closed, and rags transformed into clothing again. No one could quite believe it. They had been certain chains would bind their wrists, certain humiliation would be their fate. Instead, they stitched. Anna, the seamstress, became the heart of the group. Her fingers flew swiftly, teaching others how to make strong, hidden knots. Children gathered close to watch, their eyes wide as worn blankets thickened into quilts. "Stitch small, stitch tight," Anna murmured, a phrase that became like a prayer. One evening, using scraps of fabric, she fashioned a doll for her daughter. The child clutched it as though it were treasure, pressing her face against its crude, stitched smile. Hardened women looked away, tears burning their eyes. "This is mercy," whispered Greta, still uncertain. "Or is it mockery?" Helga, the widow, answered bitterly. "It is control. They let us sew because busy hands do not rebel." Yet even as she spoke, she mended her son's trousers. She could not deny the warmth of usefulness. Work becomes survival. Soon the camp adopted sewing as routine. American guards brought piles of fabric, ripped shirts, tattered uniforms, wool blankets riddled with holes. The women repaired them methodically. Sometimes, in exchange, guards offered bread or canned milk. At first, the prisoners suspected poison. They nibbled slowly, watching. But hunger gnawed sharper than suspicion, and when no harm came, trust, uneasy, fragile, took root. Within weeks, the barn transformed. Children slept warmer. Women stood straighter in patched dresses. Even laughter, faint and awkward, sometimes slipped into the air. Yet fear lingered. At night, whispers crept across straw beds. "This will not last. They fatten us before punishment. Kindness hides the blade." Still, the needles moved each morning. For every rumour of chains, another seam closed. For every whispered dread, another child wrapped in a quilt. A strange gift. One day a guard entered with something unusual. He placed a spool of thread on the table, bright red, vivid against the barn's grey. The women froze. Colour felt obscene in a world of ash. Greta whispered, "This is their cruelty, to remind us of beauty we cannot have." But her younger sister lifted it with trembling fingers. Slowly, she stitched a small flower into the corner of their blanket, a red bloom in a ruined world. When the guards passed that night, they paused to look. They didn't laugh. They only nodded and moved on. That flower became a secret emblem among the women, proof that maybe, just maybe, the sewing was not mockery, but recognition. Another test came days later when an American medic entered with bandages. He motioned gently, pointing to sprains and cuts. Panic spread instantly. "No!" Anna cried, clutching her daughter. "We know what you want!" But the medic said nothing. He cleaned wounds, wrapped ankles, checked fevers. Then he left. No humiliation followed, only care. Confusion deepened. Mercy was more frightening than cruelty because it stripped away certainty. Songs among stitches. By midsummer, the sewing circles became more than work. As hands moved, voices followed. Women told stories of their homes, a farm on the Rhine, a bakery in Dresden, a garden in Bremen. Some began to hum folk songs while stitching. Children picked up the tunes, their thin voices rising. The guards never silenced them. Some even lingered outside the barn, listening. One night, Greta's sister whispered, "Perhaps this is why they gave us sewing kits, to remind us we are human." Greta lay awake long after, staring at the patched quilt above her. She didn't know whether to feel grateful or afraid. Dignity in cloth. The interpreter returned one afternoon, watching the women work. Through broken German, he said, "You are prisoners, but not slaves. Keep your dignity." The word struck them harder than commands ever had. Dignity. They hadn't expected to hear it here, among straw and fences. That night, Helga muttered in the dark, "Mercy is heavier than chains, chars, inns you can fight. But mercy you carry forever." Her words lingered. Even those who distrusted the Americans could not deny the truth. Every seam stitched with enemy thread stitched dignity back into their own hearts. A final memory. When transfer orders came months later, the women packed their few belongings. Some carried scraps of bread, some clutched dolls made of rags, but most carried the sewing kits, tucked into pockets or tied in handkerchiefs. As they marched out, Greta whispered, "We were prepared for chains. Instead, they gave us tools. I will never understand." Her sister touched the red flower stitched into their blanket. "Perhaps it is not for us to understand, only to remember." And so they did. Years later, when granddaughters asked about captivity, the women did not speak of humiliation or chains. They spoke of needles and thread, of flowers sewn in silence, of dignity preserved with every stitch. In the ruins of war, mercy had appeared in the simplest of objects, and it was the absence of cruelty, not cruelty itself, that haunted them most. The transfer began before dawn. The barn doors creaked open, lantern light spilling over straw where the women had slept for months. An officer barked orders, the interpreter repeating in German, "Prepare to move, take belongings." Belongings. The word was bitter. What belongings did they have? A patched dress, a blanket, a tin cup, and, for most, the sewing kits. Anna clutched hers tightly, fingers curled around the worn wooden spool as though it were treasure. Greta tucked needles into the hem of her skirt. Even Helga, who had cursed the gifts as tools of control, slipped thread into her pocket. For all their suspicion, none would leave them behind. Outside, trucks waited. Guards lined the road, rifles slung but not raised. The women filed out, children clinging to skirts, bundles pressed against chests. They climbed into the backs of the trucks, boards rough against their hands. The engines growled, and the convoy rolled away from the barn that had become their strange sanctuary. The road away, the trucks jolted over cratered roads. Dust filled the air, stinging eyes. Villages passed by, houses roofless, chimneys collapsed, churches gutted. The women stared in silence. Every ruin reminded them of what awaited when they were finally sent home. Children whimpered. Mothers rocked them. Anna reached into her bundle and pulled out the doll she had sewn for her daughter. The girl hugged it close, whispering lullabies to herself. Other children gazed at it with longing, and before long, scraps of cloth appeared. Women threaded needles in the bouncing trucks, stitching hurried toys to quiet their little ones. Even in motion, even in fear, the rhythm of sewing endured. One American guard riding along watched curiously. He nudged the interpreter. "Why do they keep sewing?" The interpreter shrugged. "Because it is all they have left." Arrival at the camp. By midday, the trucks halted at a larger camp. Barbed wire surrounded rows of barracks. Guard towers stood tall, flags flapping in the breeze. For a moment, panic surged in the women's chests. This looked more like the prison they had dreaded. But in Sadetes, the structure was orderly. They were registered again, names recorded carefully, barracks assigned, guards guided, not shoved. The new barracks were stark but clean. Wooden bunks lined the walls. straw mattresses, a small stove at the center. Compared to the barn, it felt almost like luxury. Blankets were issued, bread distributed. And then, astonishingly, another crate appeared. Inside, more sewing supplies, needles, thread, cloth scraps. A hush fell. Greta whispered, "Again? Why always this?" Anna answered softly, "Because they know it keeps us alive." Camp life. The sewing became part of daily camp life. Some women mended clothing for guards in exchange for extra rations. Others taught younger girls stitches, turning lessons into distraction from hunger. Small markets formed, thread traded for bread, a repaired shirt for an apple. One afternoon, the guards brought in a pile of uniforms, American and German alike, torn and blood-stained. The women recoiled at first, but then Anna spoke firmly. "Cloth is cloth. If we can make something warm from it, then we must." She and others patched together quilts from pieces of both armies' uniforms. At night, children slept beneath blankets stitched from enemy cloth, their dreams wrapped in contradictions. Helga refused at first, muttering that it was humiliation. But one bitterly cold night, she pulled her son under a quilt of stitched khaki and field grey. As his breathing steadied into sleep, she whispered, "Mercy is heavier than chains." Weeks later, Red Cross officials arrived. For the first time, the women were allowed to write letters home. Paper and pencils were distributed. The women stared at the blank sheets, paralyzed. What could they say? Anna finally wrote, "We are alive. We were given sewing kits, not chains. We repair clothes. We survive." Greta's hand trembled as she scrawled, "They let us sew. It sounds foolish, but it means we are still ourselves." Helga wrote nothing at first. Then, at the last moment, she scribbled one line. "I still sew. This is how I endure." The letters were collected, sealed, and carried away. None knew if they would ever reach their homes. But the act of writing, like the act of stitching, restored something fragile. Music and thread. As autumn came, the women's sewing circles grew bolder. They began singing while they stitched, voices weaving folk songs into the air. Old hymns, lullabies, songs of harvest and home. Guards sometimes lingered outside the barracks, listening quietly. One evening, Anna embroidered words into a patch of cloth. "Wir leben noch," we are still alive. She stitched it in red thread, the same color Greta's sister had once used to sew a flower. When she finished, she pinned it above the stove. The women gathered around, reading silently. Some wept, others smiled faintly. "We live," Greta whispered, "and we sew. That is our defiance." Release. In late winter, orders came again. The war was over. Prisoners were to be released gradually, repatriated across a shattered Germany. The women packed. Once more, sewing kits were the most precious possession. Some tucked them into boots, others hid them in hair braids. When guards searched their belongings, they allowed the kits to remain. Perhaps they understood. The trucks rolled out once more, carrying them through landscapes of ruin. Bridges lay collapsed, towns stood hollow, but still the women clutched, their needles and thread as if they were weapons. Homecoming. When they finally returned to their villages, the women discovered home was not home. Roofs gone, streets rubble, families scattered or dead. Their sewing became more than memory, it became necessity. Anna rebuilt her life as a seamstress. She sewed dresses from curtains, coats from army blankets. Her daughter, now old enough to hold a needle, helped at her side. Greta taught sewing to children in the ruins of a school, using scraps to make satchels and shoes. "We survived because of this," she told them. "Remember." Even Helga, who had cursed the kits, admitted their worth. She patched her son's clothes endlessly, whispering, "The Americans gave us this, and it gave us back ourselves." Legacy. Years later, when grandchildren asked about the war, the women spoke reluctantly. They described hunger, fear, nights of weeping. but always they mentioned the sewing. "They gave us kits instead of chains," Anna told her granddaughter. "I will never understand why, but I know this. Every stitch was a piece of my dignity returned." Greta showed her family the red flower blanket, preserved across decades. "This was made in captivity," she said, "not with shame, but with thread." Helga, before her death, left her son a single spool of thread. In her will, she wrote, "Chains can bind your body, but a needle in your hand can mend your soul." Historians often measure wars in bombs dropped, battles won, empires collapsed. But for the German POW women of 1945, history was measured in stitches, in the quiet rhythm of needles piercing cloth, in the red thread that bloomed into flowers against grey. They had been told to expect chains. Instead, they were given sewing kits. And in that shocking absence of cruelty, they found something far stranger: the chance to stitch together fragments of dignity in a world that had torn everything apart.